everyone. Before we begin this session, I'd just like to introduce myself and acknowledge country and acknowledge elders, both past, present and emerging, and acknowledge my uncles and aunties who have been with us over the last couple of days. And my name is Lorena Barker. I'm a Wankamara Murawari woman from Western New South Wales. My kinship spans the 3 states. I've got kinship connections to the Adnyamathin in the Ranges, the Coomera and Punya people in southwest Queensland, the Wankamara people who go across those Queensland, southwest Queensland and New South Wales to a place called Tibooburra, and the Barkindji, and of course the Murawari in northwestern South Wales. And it gives me great pleasure to be introducing our 3 historians and anthropologists, the professors. All I understand have had laureates or got laureates. So very distinguished historians and anthropologists. And some of the things Professor Anne McGrath, Professor Lynette Russell, and Professor Alison Bashford. And I think just reading some of what we'll cover this afternoon, things like in Anne's abstract, what is history and truth telling. We covered some of that today and during our Yarning session yesterday. The global encounters and what that means, and also Gondwana land, and something that I'm very interested in, and what that means for deep history, but also what does that mean for my project, which when we, in the last session, we talked about, we mentioned legacy, and some of which when we finish this session as part of the questions, we might come back to. But I'm also a part of a project called Songlines of Country, which was also inspired by deep history. And bumping into Anne, I think it was a year into the project, yeah, at a conference, most likely AHA.
Was it dinner?
Yeah, the dinner. And I heard about her deep history, and I'd asked her and queried her and said, how come you skipped over the fish traps at Breadening? And it's one of the oldest man-made structures in the world. It's older than the pyramids, it's older than Stone Age, and it's older than the pyramids of South America. And so, and then at the same time, I was working with elders in Breadening in Western New South Wales, going to on-country gatherings, bringing them all together to share stories about them, what life was like on missions and reserves. And at the same time, the big story about the Seven Sisters songlines was on show in camp here. And so as part of our yarning sessions, when we're having a cup of tea and hanging out, having a bickie or two, they were saying, well, we've got stories, we should go down there to see this big story. And how come nobody's come and talked to us about our Seven Sisters stories? And so that really got me going, and I decided, well, if anyone's going to do that, then I'll have to put an application in, and just for us to tell our stories of the corner country of where our 3 states meet, and to tell our songlines. And so that's how the Songlines of Country project started. And of course, it was funded by the ARC. And we're on the tail end of it as well. So we've got another almost 18 months, I think, left of the project. And people talk about legacies, and again, that's one of the legacies of the Deep History project. But I'll hand it over to Anne. And thanks, Anne.
Well, thanks, Lorena. I'm glad that us leaving your mob out meant that you did the wonderful project. But it was actually, I think your people wanted you to do it and you to run it. Come on, right? Fess up, they did. But that other project, which was with Mary and Jeb actually, was, and several other people, was actually just focusing on World Heritage. But, you know, those fishcraft should be World Heritage and they should be classified that way. So in my abstract, I did, again, pose that thorny question, what is history? And I think that's partly what it's been about, you know, with what we're doing. History, what is history? It's always been this umbrella term that, you know, amorphous term. I guess I, as a historian working in the academy, have been interested in expanding the meaning of what history is. And I also worked in the National Museum because I did feel frustrated by the fact that history was so text-oriented. I wanted to be involved in the 3D and so on, but unfortunately, I joined the National Museum when John Howard was the Prime Minister, and the whole board was terrible, and they were shocked by the thought that they would even mention massacre in the National Museum. And it wasn't really a happy time to be at the National Museum. But yeah, it's been great in this project to have the expertise of people like Mike, who has enabled us to do wonderful digital interpretation, tabs, and of course the whole talented postdoc team, Ben and Amy and Laura, have been wonderful to work with, and a privilege to give them opportunities through the funding that we have. And I hope it's not from the ARC here, but they really don't check at the end whether you've exactly done everything you said you're going to do at the beginning. They're probably busy, they don't do that. It's very accountable as to what you spent your money on, but they're not going to criticise you for slightly changing the timeline and exactly what you're going to do every year and so on. So, yes, I love the title that the co-curators of this conference have given this session, Broadening Horizons. I had hoped to have some kind of offshoot spin-off meeting with Lynette and Alison about where we go to from here with our research centre for deep history. Because we did have these global ambitions, and as you heard, some of them we succeeded in. But also we want to broaden the idea of deep history beyond only something encapsulated by the continent of Australia, I guess. And that's something Lynette and I already did in our Routledge book about Indigenous global history. But of course it's been so busy, this whole agenda, we haven't actually had a chance to even speak. That's right. And I also had to go off to this Academy of Humanities AGM thing. But I love broadening horizons as a concept for history. And one of the things I was thinking about was that how a lot of the famous historians have used the analogy of a window, and they say, look through the windows to the past, or through a glass darkly, as Greg Denny wrote a lovely book of reflections on that. And I'm thinking, I'm really glad we're not looking through a window or looking through glass, we're actually looking at horizons, you know, and broadening the horizons. So I like that idea of being out on country and thinking about place without having to do it from an interior or from a Western house, or, you know, this sort of concept of what history is, perhaps written at a writing desk looking through a window, like Manning Clark House from his turret, which is very nearby. One of the things about the discipline of history is it's been addressing a story for nation, creating and imagining and, you know, inventing stories to make people feel this collective sense of we've all had shared this past. And in Indigenous Australia, there are many nations, and we as the general public, I suppose, a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, can easily still fall into this trap, I think, of nation as something singular, and yet we've got to learn that the history of Indigenous nations is plural. It's not the history of nation like the imagined white nation history was going to once be. And yeah, other people did, and of course Dan Smail also mentioned that idea of the love. So challenges of periodisation and temporality, that's huge in this project. the politics of history has to be relevant. I think history is always political. I think nearly every narrative is political. And I think that as well as being local, we also need to be global and broad in our horizons. So I'll keep going back to that. And this is about thinking about the future and the legacies of sort of where we go next and so forth. When I was first thinking about this, I was sort of, I actually gave a paper about temperatures and temporalities at a conference in Cambridge, and I think that's an interesting way to think about the way Indigenous people reflect on history. And we've got to keep remembering that Indigenous people have lived in this country when it was still connected north. It was, sometimes called Suffolk now. There are islands like Victoria Island near Cairns, which were connected to the mainland. There are rivers that were not even formed, there are volcanoes happening. There's a lot of stories of different climatic created worlds that Indigenous people actually have inhabited. They've been there. Even Botany Bay was quite different 1,000 years ago to when Captain Cook turned up. And so Indigenous people have been on a continent which is geographically, physically different, and they have stories about that. So once again, I think we can forget that is a concrete kind of temporality, that people who tell stories of a nation evolving less than 300 years ago forget that the continent is not always the same. So when we talk about place, we're not talking about static place. We're talking about a changing place and a related place that is kin. And I think it's fascinating to think about the history that way, and or even when you write history of settler colonialism, to reflect on the fact that these people who may be encountering Europeans that have actually been encountering a new river forming or something changing course, all these things that have happened. So many things I could say here. One of the challenges to the project, which I did outline in my original application, was the challenge of periodisation. How can we write a history without there being periods and chunks of time, because that's the way we people in the academy write history. And so I knew the archaeologists were already dividing the world up into time. Like they have a journal called the Quaternary Journal, and that's a whole sort of field of archaeology. It's about the earth, and in fact, going back to the Greek myths, some of these climatic zones going way, way back in Earth's history are named after gods, like there's the Hadean period. Aeon, or Eon, how do you pronounce it, is actually another Greek word from the legend. So we've got this Western civilization, Greek cultural thing, even informing the way we think about deep time going back before humans, before hominids. So I did think, well, in the 19th century, there was this stadial approach, which wasn't so much about time zones as about stages of human development. And so Gordon Child sort of got away from that and instead conceived of the world not in time, not in terms so much of evolution as revolution. And so he talks about the human inventions that changed across the globe. But that wasn't a solution either. But then when carbon dating came along and more sophisticated dating techniques, there was a much more of an interest not in stages and dividing the world into periods that might be seen as cultural, but rather just dates and measurement. And so there's the Pleistocene, the Upper Pleistocene, and these sort of climatic zones, temperatures of the Earth were actually defining the story of Indigenous history in deep time. And I felt that this was evoking a deterministic approach. It was seemed dehumanising to me. So I was probably more interested in cultural ideas, but there I was actually thinking of Western changes in culture, like the Enlightenment, the Middle Ages, where people were more superstitious, these sort of cultural ideas of history. And really, I don't think that yeah, we didn't get very far with that. So that's an example of what we weren't able to do. But the reason we weren't was because we did engage very closely with Indigenous modes of historical practice and what they saw as important in terms of the ways they thought about their deep past. And we were exposed and tried to think and reflect upon this idea of the evergreen. And I do find that, you know, it's hard to explain in English, but there are some beautiful Indigenous language words that try to encapsulate it. We also emphasised the mapping project, not only because we were trying to speak back to the explorers' maps and the navigation maps and overland explorers' European maps, but also because of the great emphasis we found on place, you know, like deepening histories of place, that Indigenous people were telling story on country and from the perspective of being in place. But what is also clear, and this is knowledge that the Yalwa people really shared with me, and that is that there are a lot of Indigenous people now doing these calendars. And you see they're often cyclical calendars with all these seasons, very distinctive, sometimes 16 seasons. And it's not just about the temperature, whether it rains or not, it's about which wind is there, which animals there, which eggs being laid. It's the whole detail of the whole ecology, ecosystem in different times. Well, the Yalwa people really, like Diane Appleby, who had to leave and who shared that beautiful perspective before she left, they talk, because I kept saying, well, you know, history, what is it? What if an event happened? How would you describe that in temporally? You know, how would you think about that in terms of temporality? And they sort of explained that what happened was in a season, and so it was what happened in that season and what wind you felt on your face and what smell and what was happening. That's when a historical event happens. So rather than being calendar years, it's this idea of, oh, it happened in the season. I found that a very profound idea. I'm still not great at expressing it, but I found that a really interesting concept in terms of time and the calendar. And I must say that Diane also, when I was talking to her about these calendars, she sort of went, oh yeah, white people love these calendars. And I think that once again, it's a diagram in a circle, and it's a very still a Western way of thinking about time and calendar and seasons, which is probably a communication device to white people, not necessarily something really coming from inside. And of course, Indigenous art is so often telling a story of a map, it's country, it's history, it's biography, it's everything all rolled into one. But we didn't use Indigenous art because that you know would there'd be a lot of copyright issues and so forth. But you know we've been looking at rock art and so forth rather than the contemporary practices of Indigenous art. So the Evergreen concept combines past, present and future in a kind of multiverse where time folds in on itself. And it connects ancestral creation worlds with all that exists in place, geographies of land and water, animals, plants and stars. Australian practices for knowing, remembering and reenacting the past find embodiment in the present, blurring the distinctions of linear time. It is not just cyclical, it's not just a circle, it's always. So the practices of Indigenous history are very diverse, but often song, story, language, art, performance are really, really vital. There's also different temporal ideas, like sunset can be translated as slowing down or cold time. So to me, that's a more sensual approach to time, rather than just, oh yeah, you know, like that's a certain time of day and sunsets. It's more about the physical experience of time. And then, of course, I won't go into all the specific examples, but some groups see the future as aligning from east to west, and others see the past as being in front. And and this always gets me because all the politicians always going, we're moving forward. You know, it's like, well, not according to that group, but, you know, because moving forward is moving into the past. And the logic of that's very clear because they say you can see what's happened in front of you. You know that, so that's in front of you. The past you can't see, it's still coming. So there are a lot of Indigenous notions of time that vary across the continent, you know, and they're very specific. And this idea they don't have a notion of time or words for history is in fact incorrect. The linguists will tell you that there are words for the past and the future and the present, but there's a different ontology of temporality. And of course, you know, Neil did discuss origin stories and what he describes as myths and so on. And you know, that's a very complex field. And we're just learning more and more from meeting Indigenous knowledge holders about such things. So when I was asking and trying to find out, the wind is very important. Like, how often do academic historians think about the wind? You know, but I've found a lot of stories about winds and a central feeling of the wind. And there's also migration stories across the continent, and I'll talk about the winds and the winds. You probably know there's creative forces that, you know, Laureate is doing very close knowledge work. But I'd like to quote, you know, you might have noticed that Diane Appleby talked of the Bugaragara, and it's a word for everything, dreaming, law, everywhere. So it's everything in that word. But Peter Yu, who actually opened the symposium today, explained this. The Bugaragara encompasses a time well before Western philosophy, religion, and laws reached our lands. The Bugaragara is associated with events that created our world deep at the beginning of time, yet it transcends time and space to inform and give meaning to contemporary Yawuru life. It's a spiritual force that shapes our cultural values and practices, our relationship with our country, and the responsibilities and obligations that we teach each other as Yawuru people. And the word Buru, Yawuru, actually means place and time together. So Einstein would have learned something from the Yawuru people. But you know, they do have these lovely concepts, which Diane also introduced, of lian, which is this sense of well-being, being in country, being in place. And this, I think, also has interesting temporal dimensions. But yeah, so just finally, I think it's interesting the emphasis we place on calendar time, and I think the beginning of history in England is attributed to Bede, who did chronologies of English history, and hence that's considered when proper history started. But I started to read some of Bede's books, and he's talking about, you know, people jumping up and coming back to life and all sorts of things, which are not what we might call history, but it was just the fact that he had chronologies of these things happening that gave him this authority. But as I often say, I think he's the only historian who ever became a saint, so I don't know whether any other people will be following. But when the British ships came in 1770, 1788, it was a time of a great flourishing of new means of measurement that were really helping navigation, helping, you know, the chronometers being invented, the longitude, great competition to get the best technologies to measure longitude and latitude and so on. So we're looking at the beginnings of European Australia as being assessed by measurement and, you know, the transit of Venus and how long that took. And I think that's an interesting contrast of how, you know, our foundations as a European invader nation were very much based on this flourishing of new forms of measurement. And so just to finish, one Yawuru elder, Budi, explained, the invasion happened, but it didn't change this. People must stay with the time, stay with the law of the country. It is ongoing and never stops. Because Bugaragara made this for us, and we carry the law for Bugaragara. It's all from when time began, we follow that. This is our time. It's a living thing. So hopefully reflecting on these approaches might help historians think beyond the constraints of modernity's measurements and periodisations and beyond the Anthropocene's temporal predispositions. Thank you.
up next time.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for staying on. It's interesting, Anne mentioned Broadening, and I've always been deeply influenced and affected by Denning's work. I call myself an experiential historian or an anthropological historian. Just a little background, I trained, my initial training is in science, but I left that. And then I trained as an archaeologist in anthropological archaeology. Then I did a PhD in history. So I've always had this sort of deeply interdisciplinary approach to the work that I do. I'm very interested in the wind, I might add. Having written a book on mariners, I found one of the most important things I had to do was go and stand on ships and experience what it's like to be on a ship. I'm not a good sailor either. I get very seasick, but it was important to have that wind in my face, to feel those things. Because I think if we're going to broaden our horizons, we have to also broaden our experiences. In order to understand history, we actually have to move it outside the text. It needs to be, I mean, we're very fortunate to have seen some wonderful digital expressions of history, and we know there's lots of beautiful artwork and installations and things that are all forms of historical engagement. So we're moving way beyond the text, which in my opinion is a really wonderful thing to do. My current project, as I said earlier, looks at 1,000 years of Australians' engagement with people from outside. So it's Dutch, French, you know, the Macassans. It basically stops the British. The reason I wanted to stop it before the British arrived was because I feel there's been far too much centrality placed on that arrival. It was merely the last in a very, and certainly the most disruptive, but it doesn't mean that it was the only. And I think it's really important that we look at the trajectory of the ways in which Indigenous Australians have engaged with people from other places. They have ranged from accommodated and engaged, negotiated, almost treaty-like, as we have with the Yolngu and the Macassans, right through to, you know, violent kidnapping and all sorts of, you know, pretty horrendous things happen in some cases. There's a uncle made the comment, he loves to humorise, and I love that, loves to humorise them. It's a great joke that almost every Indigenous artist I've ever worked with plays on you at some stage, and they'll show you a piece of work, or you will have a piece of their work, and they'll say, you got it upside down. And it always happens to me, and I always fall for it. Oh no! And it's irrelevant, because there is no up or down. This art is not about a bird's eye view. It's not about the drone flying over the landscape. That's what I really think we can do if we're going to broaden our horizons. We can turn it upside down so that in the end, nobody really knows which way's up and which way's not. It's really powerful for me to be part of a program. This is a multidisciplinary and multi-level program, and that's a really powerful thing. And it's rare in Australia to have people who are fluent in other languages working in an Indigenous program. That's very unusual. So we've got Dutch specialists, we've got French specialists, we've got Indonesian specialists as well. These are the sorts of things that I think are really profoundly important if we are going forward in our horizons. Otherwise, we're just going to keep telling the same old stories, maybe with a little bit of new, quote unquote, evidence, with some new sources. But we are simply telling the same stories because we know the end point. We know the beginning point, we know the end point. Because so many of those stories literally start, if not 1770, they certainly start in the 18th century. And we know that this is just an absolute nonsense. You know, you've got the Dutch bumping into Western Australia, certainly in the 1600s, and we've got people in Northern Australia, we would argue probably much earlier than that. Archaeologists have excavated ceramics in Torres Strait indicating Chinese ceramics. Now I'm not for a microsecond suggesting Chinese were in Torres Strait, but it certainly indicates that Torres Strait was part of a global network of trade. and exchange. I've just come back from Indonesia and Makassar, where we ran a series of really interesting workshops and collaborated with our basically our affiliate researchers in both Jakarta and Makassar. And one of the things that really became very profound to me was, first of all, the story of the Indonesian relationship with Australia is as unknown in Indonesia as it is in Australia. Basically, I often have this conversation, and Campbell McKnight often says to me, "Oh, people definitely should know this. They should know this." But I still find that they don't know this. And every time, just quite recently in Kimberley, you will have noticed there appeared to be a Indonesian fishing camp described as as an illegal arrival of Indonesian fishing people, simply doing what they've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, arriving, fishing the waters and then going again, usually with permission, usually with negotiation, exchange, trade relationships. People weren't just coming for the tree pan, they were also coming for pearl shell and turtle shell. And more recently, we've discovered beeswax. Significant quantities of beeswax was being traded on these vessels. If we think about Indonesia, what do we think of? We think about batik. Batik, you need wax to make batik. So here we have wax from Northern Australia being traded to Indonesia, potentially becoming batik. Batik picked up by the Dutch, taken to South Africa, becoming the Dutch waxed cloth, which they now make in South Africa, along the same lines as batik. All of these things are ways in which the encounter in Australia can be tied into a global history. When we were in Makassar, we went to a wonderful museum, and we had the former director of the museum, who has apparently been retired for 17 years, who turned up to take us through and talk to us. And he organised an interpreter, and he talked to us for probably 2 hours. In between, I was there with Ian, in between he and I having hordes of school kids trying to take selfies with us, because no one had, they were not familiar with Western looking people, and they certainly weren't familiar with tall people. And I'm not very tall, but Ian is, so we just had this group of people following us around with selfies being taken. And he showed us a map, and it was a map of the Kingdom of Goa, G-O-W-A, not the one in India. And the map is drawn, and it comes all the way down to Northern Australia and just takes in the top of Northern Australia. There is a sense there that Australia was connected. People in Australia may well not have had any notion that they were connected in this way, but this was a political statement that this was their trade network. At the moment, we're talking with our colleagues in Indonesia who are very keen to get World Heritage status, and some of us in our team have got some experience working on World Heritage bids. And they want to get World Heritage status for the spice routes. And my argument is the tree pan industry and the mocassins arriving in Northern Australia is the north and south. It's the southern and easternmost eastern part of the spice routes. Without the spice routes, nobody comes to Australia with tree pan, because the tree pan is part of the Chinese market. The Chinese market rises as a result of people trading silks. Silks are what they trade for spice. Australia is not isolated. It's never been isolated. It's part of a global network. And one of the things, if we're going to broaden our horizons, we have to stop thinking of this continent as an island and start thinking of it as part of the entire planet. It's much more than just, the coastline that we've currently got. It's much more than that. And of course, that coastline has changed. We know that. Anne showed some maps of Sahul. We know that the coastline has changed on and off over many thousands of years, but nonetheless, Australia has been visited. We know people arrived here 65,000 years ago. They came from somewhere. They've come from Southeast Asia as the most recent, as the routes would suggest. So if we're going to broaden our horizons, my feeling is We need to incorporate a whole lot of new evidence. Some of that evidence is oral history, very important. The stories, the songs, the dances that commemorate encounter. We need to incorporate botanical evidence. I mentioned this today. Tobacco arrives in Northern Australia, tamarind trees arrive in Northern Australia. None of these things are native. We still haven't explained the boa. We still don't know how we get that here. It did not float across from Africa. That's not a possibility. Botanists tell us. We know that there are biological markers, certain genetic markers. We know that there are linguistic markers. There are linguistic terms through Australian languages that indicate a relationship with cultures from outside of Australia. We need to let that sink in a little bit. People say, oh, they're loan words or they're borrowed words. These are profoundly important markers of relationships with people from outside of Australia. This is not an isolated nation. It's not an isolated place. And then we've got the archaeological evidence. We've got the wonderful images of prows and Macassar ships. More recently, images of Moroccan warships painted on the rocks in Northern Australia. So we've got the archaeological evidence. I mentioned Chinese ceramics in Torres Strait. There's so much, it's so rich. We're only 2 years into this project and I'm already thinking there's no way in the world we can do justice to this. I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to think, and of course, like everybody else, we have been hammered by the pandemic, and we're taking your example, Anne, and assuming at this point we'll get an extension, a 2-year extension too. So in the next 4 years, 4.5 years, we will have something really to say about this. But I'm just going to finish. If we really want to make a difference to the way we understand Australian history, it's not about me sitting in a room of like-minded people having a conversation. It's about getting into schools. It's incumbent on us that it has to be part of the curriculum. Next year, I want to run alongside the History Teachers Association, a symposium or a seminar or something where we actually sit down and say, how much of this stuff do you teach? Because I know I've gone through the curriculums and it's not significantly advanced from when my kids went to school, and they're grown-ups, and it really hasn't advanced very much. So we need to be, as professional historians, it's absolutely essential that we make that effort, because that's where the next generation of historians come from, but it's also where the next generation of citizens come from. And the next generation of citizens need to make this a better country than the one we've got now. And we can't expect them to do that if we haven't actually educated them properly. So that's our role, change stories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me today, and Ben and everybody else in the centre, and how honoured we all are to hear Anne McGrath and Lynette Russell. And I love that on the one hand we're hearing about deep history and everywhen, and then immediately after that we learn so much from Lynette's incredible intervention, I think, to make us all think about this specific period, which is 1,000 years, which used to seem really a long time, and now seems like, what does Dan Smith call it? Shallow, And I think that that's a measure of how much, in a way, our understandings as historians of periodization and lengths of time have really been rattled by the conversations that you have all had in this centre, but also I think more widely amongst our generation and younger generations of historians in Australia. So I'm going to talk a little while, taking the beyond, it made me think of which project will I talk about? And this is not the Laureate project at all. We call it the Gondwana Land Project, and it comes out of my group at UNSW, which is called the New Earth Histories Research Project. And it is deep history. In a way, I come to deep history not necessarily from an Australian base or thinking about Australian history, actually, but I also come to deep time through other disciplines that come up against me all the time because my original training is in history of science. So I've got a little bit of an odd way into the deep time and deep history enterprise, even though, as that's true, so much of my thinking about deep time and deep history has been from and inside this country, and of course affected by all of the particular Australian conversations. So let me tell you about Gondwana land and how it might be a bit beyond for deep history. Let me tell you the story about how this project came about. At a conference, can't remember what or when or even where, but I do remember who. An old friend, old scholarly friend, Pratik Chakrabarti, some of you will know Pratik or will read his work. We're at a conference that my mother was putting on. And we just did what we all do. Hi Pratik, great to see you again, how's the family, all that, and what are you working on? It's always the, what are you working on? And that's what you really want to get to, And he said, oh, I'm just working through, he's a historian of science as well. I'm working through history of science on Gondwana land. And I said, oh, how interesting that you're doing such an Australian topic. And he said, why is that? And I said, oh, Gondwana land, your average person in the street in Australia would have some sense. I think this is true, but I know this is true, because in our project we've done surveys on it. Your average person on the street across Australia, different streets, different people, have some sense of what Gondwana land is, some sense that it's an ancient supercontinent, that it connected Australia with Antarctica, with South Asia, with South America, and with Southern Africa. That there's some awareness of that. and so Pratik was really interested in the fact that there's a kind of a currency for this idea of Gondwana land. And I said, that's interesting, but that's not really why I think it's an Australian topic. And he said, why do you think it's an Australian topic? I said, because, this is confession, because Gondwana is an Indigenous word. And I said, I don't know exactly where it's from, but it's from a community somewhere in Australia. Wouldn't it be interesting to find out? And Pratik laughed and laughed. And thank goodness we were friends and still are, I was so mortified. And I said, what is so funny? And he said, Gondwana land is named after the province, Gondwana, in northern central India, which is named after the Gond people. And in that moment, once I got over my embarrassment, but I'll tell you more about that in a moment. I shouldn't be as embarrassed as I was then, brackets, because in our research now, we've been running around asking a whole lot of Australians, including some Indigenous Australians, about what the word Gondwana, and about 98% of them imagine, as I did, that it is from here. So here's this great revelation, and in fact Gondwana land, that we're all so familiar with, doesn't in fact belong to us at all, so to say. It belongs to the Gond people, who are in Indian terms a tribal registered tribal group in central India. North central India, and there was for many years, there's not now, a province, an administrative unit called Gondwana, and it was, for those of us who don't know, in about the 1880s, in what was then the province of Gondwana, named after the Gond people, there were a lot of, happened to be a lot of Scottish geologists in that area. They found fossils. I'll go through everything. They found fossils, the Drosophilus fossil, very common fossil, and a few of them said, oh, I've seen that before in New South Wales, or I've seen it in Southern Africa, and that is where the idea of, or an awareness of the knowledge that these continents and these places were at one point linked by land comes from. And so they named this phenomenon Gondwana land, and increasingly over the 20th century got folded into plate tectonics and so forth. And that's what we understand on the street. So but the point for me, really, I suppose, I hope for us, is that in that moment of hilarity over public critique and incomprehension and sudden comprehension on my part, sprang forward what is for me turning out to be the collaborative project of a lifetime. So we've got together historians, Pratik on South Asia, and myself and Sandro Antonello from Flinders, who's a historian of Antarctica, some South American historians, and some southern historians of Southern Africa, to think through what we call the modern history of an ancient supercontinent. So what is the politics? How did Gondwana land, straightforward history of science, how did Gondwana land, unfold? That's interesting to me, but not necessarily to the world. In a way, far more interesting for us all is, and for our purposes here, what Gondwana land, the idea, yields for those of us who are interested in periodization, who are interested in thinking about really deep pasts and now, on a completely different axis, and actually a much more straightforward axis, actually, but still interesting, I think, to the everywhere that has been discussed with such complexity here. Nonetheless, for me and for our team, this phenomenon of Gondwana land is putting substance and a kind of enchanting place time to the project of thinking 200 million years ago, which geologists tell us was when Gondwana land broke up, with 1880, when we've got these Scottish geologists finding fossil leaves, with very present politics of several orders. And let me just give you a snippet of those, in a way, what's at stake in thinking about deep history through Gondwana land, or what might be yielded. But first, I just want to signal the extent to which, once you start looking for Gondwana in Australia, that's not Australian to start with, it's everywhere, and it is being ironically completely nationalised by us. Actually, I think as a very comfortable way of thinking deep time and belonging. That's now my take on Gondwana, on the term Gondwana here. But look here, there's always this kind of symbolic and often actual kind of connection to Indigenous Australia over and over again, sometimes explicitly. Sometimes not. This is a geology, this is a fossil hunting tourist group. So this term Gondwana, there is about 500 and something companies registered in Australia now that use Gondwana or Gondwana land as a title, and that is everything from, as we saw before, Gondwana art galleries to day spas to choirs to bands to mineral extraction companies, and I'll tell you the irony about that in a little while. So there's been this weird nationalising of Gondwana, and I think it's a lot of people's ideas, but my sense is that it's a very comfortable way of talking about deep time belonging for white fellows in Australia. That's what I'm starting to perceive it as being, and I'd like some kind of views. But here is the actual Gondwana, a late 19th century map of Gondwana in central India. And what I want to say about that is what Gondwana actually means for the Gond people. So what I've learned in this collaborative project through involving Gond people in conversation with us is several things. One is that there are several Gond members of parliament in India Second, they have a very familiar politics to many people here, which is actually a land rights politics, because they were cleared off the land for reasons to do with those fossils. Those fossils became coal, became fossil fuels, became mining, and Gond, who's an original pre-Muslim, pre-Hindu original group in India, were moved off the land and want to reclaim their land in quite familiar land rights terms. And from the 1970s, they have been doing so with recourse to the idea of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana land. And so they will say, we should and need to be returned to our land because we have been there since the time of Gondwana land. And so there's this total mobilization in Gond politics of this ancient supercontinent. And that's from about the 1970s onwards. So there's a weird, fascinating folding and refolding of odd periods of time and a very different way into deep time. It's also the case that we had a fantastic conference in August and we were able, thank goodness, to bring people to Sydney to talk through this. And what we learned, what I learned, is also that Gond people not only use the idea of Gondwana land, and we've been here at least since the time of Gondwana land, to push forward land claims. So the stakes are really high. But they also there is also a religious cultural folding of the Gondwana land story into modern pilgrimages. So there is a pilgrimage that happens once a year. Thousands of people. So our colleague showed us thousands of people now make their way up to the cave where the fossil was found by the Scottish geologists, and some of the Scottish geologists are semi-sanctified. So there's a whole kind of folding there of many eras of stories that's absolutely fascinating before you even get to Australia. And the other thing that I want to say to link these places and stories, there's a political pamphlet from a Gond group, and you can see the rendition there of Gondwana land, and how very particular and how much they belong now, not to just Gondwana, but Gondwana land. And this gives them a kind of a depth of time argument as well. There's one extra layer there that is of maybe uncomfortable interest to us. And that is to say that Gond people who claim Gondwana land, not just Gondwana, the region in northern India, also claim themselves to be the original people of the entire southern hemisphere. And so they claim themselves to be, as one person in my team said, the First Nations of Gondwana land. So there is this strange there's a very strange global south going on here, apart from anything else. But there is absolutely, and I spent so much time trying to clarify exactly what this claim was. And as I understand it, the claim is, I'll tell you about this map in a minute, the claim is that Gondwana is an original place for all the people in the southern hemisphere. And at that point, I was able to ask, does that include the many different nations of Indigenous people of Australia? Absolutely, yes. So there is a very, very interesting retelling of this ancient supercontinent and a folding of it over time and over place into these many mythologies. And for those of us who imagine that science itself somehow sets outside, this is another comment I want to make maybe later, science itself is filled with mythics, and I think it's a mistake actually, Anne, for us to think of science as settled, as measured and so forth. the conventional history of geosciences, you only have to scratch the surface and you've got Genesis, dust, 6 days, in creation of the world, so sometimes I think we misunderstand how, and I use the word mythic very specifically, is the history of science itself. And so this is history of science, circa, the 19th century. This is from Haeckel, the great Darwinist. You don't get more canonical science than that. And he has all people starting here from what he calls Lemuria. But even Douglas Mawson, the great card-carrying geologist Douglas Mawson, says in the 1930s, Lemuria, the supposed sunken continent of Lemuria, is actually just a late, a more elevated part of Gondwana land. And Haeckel here is understanding all here. This is what Gon people are also, they love this map. It shows all southern hemisphere people starting from here. And the last bit I want to add to that, to kind of fold the stories and the science and the mythology and the periodization together, is how we've learned in our team by inviting actually a specialist in the history of Lemuria, which actually is a mythic continent, whereas Gondwana land we know is real. Lemuria was kind of invented at the same time, and we don't think actually has a geological actuality. However, it so happens that the European idea of Lemuria, or the sunken continent of Lemuria, folded into Tamil, southern Indian and Tamil understandings very, very deeply, to the extent that Lemuria is understood to be the sunken homeland of the Tamils. And I learned in August through a Tamil expert that on what she calls the Land's End of India, not Sri Lanka, but India, there is a huge temple to a Tamil goddess, quite recently built, and her entire job is to look into the to look into the Indian Ocean to protect Lemuria, which is the sunken homeland of the Tamils. So this is also part of the large Gondwana land story, and you can see why, on the one hand, there's this, the original moment of imagining the Gondwana land somehow belonged to this country, but also it does, because it's part of our language, it's part of our culture. It is used and reused all the time. To what effect and for what purpose, I think, is part of what we want to discuss. But it's folded into all of these other Indigenous stories elsewhere. And again, thank you to Lynette and Anne for making us all think about global Indigenous. And I'll stop there with just a few pictures about much more in the shallow end of mythology, that Gondwana land. The term has been used over and over to think through deep past belonging of all kinds of spurious and difficult modes. It's been used in the 1970s to imagine that kind of environmentalist one world. I can't begin to tell you how many Gondwana theme parks there are across the world, especially for some reason in Germany. But here Gondwana and prehistory kind of stand for each other. And here's the one I just want to leave you with, and then I'll shush. My absolute favourite. Once I started thinking about what cultural work does Gondwana do in terms of making us think differently about time and place, I started looking in science fiction, and Gondwana and Gondwana land is everywhere in science fiction from the beginning, from Jules Verne onwards. And the classic trope in science fiction of the earth opening up and we're falling through time and space, and the protagonist will wake up and they're in Gondwana land. And sometimes Gondwana land has people in it, but more often we're in these science fiction worlds of Gondwana land. It is a place without other humans. It it's got large beasts, it's usually a kind of an Australian rainforesty, and there's no other humans. It's a non-human place. And so that's really interesting. And now I realise, in fact, in the literary world, the use of Gondwana land as a non-human space is how I'm starting to understand it, as a way to understand a non-human space or a pre-human earth is very common. And the last slide I'll show you, which mixes up all of that, is a children's story about Antarctica, where Antarctica, obviously recognisable here as the continent, but Antarctica is renamed Gondwana, and in this story, the Indigenous people of Antarctica, renamed as Gondwana, are the Gonds. So the kind of mixing, once you start digging in to Gondwana land, it yields all of this mixing up. But what I want to finish with is not Gondwanas actually, so much as I do think if this project had fallen in my lap, or if Pratik and I had that conversation 20 years ago, I think I would have nodded and moved on, actually. And by that, what I mean is that I think it's the Australian scholarly historical time and place, not least because of the work that many people have done, but the work that you've done, Anne and Lynette. It's because of that conversation that goes on in all our heads, isn't it just wonderful that we get to do this? It's because of all of that conversation about how do we think about deep time and what is time and place, and the kind of third-hand ways in which, because of the way I come to this interdisciplinary terms, still the third-hand way in which, as an Australian scholar, I've got to think about every when. We all do. And if I hadn't been kind of primed with all of that, I don't know that in that conversation I would have gone, that is the strangest folding of time and place. And so it's kind of primed that possibility. Thanks.